Good evening. I am Jason Fair, class of 1989, and it is my pleasure to serve as president of the Memphis University School Alumni Board. And I'd like to welcome Mr. Hiltonsmith's family, our distinguished faculty and faculty emeriti, alumni, and special guests to the unveiling of the 14th portrait in a series of faculty portraits that are on display here in the dining hall. The portrait series was created by the Alumni Executive Board in 2005 to honor MUS faculty members who have dedicated their lives serving our great and beloved school. There have been many changes to the appearance of the school over the last 2 decades, but these portraits serve as a daily reminder to alumni, students, faculty, and friends that even though the school's physical appearance may change over time, our faculty have been unchanging in their steadfast commitment to provide the highest quality teaching and excellent experience that our students and alumni treasure for a lifetime. Simply put, faculty are the foundation upon which the excellence of this school rests. The Alumni Board determined the criteria for the selection of each faculty portrait recipient. To qualify, nominees cannot be current members of faculty, and they must have served MUS for a minimum of 15 years. There's a remarkably high number of people who meet those criteria, which to me shows the high level of commitment and dedication that our faculty have to this school. And personally, having been part of many of those nomination committee meetings, I can say that there is a very impressive list of people that we have to pick from. The discussions when we vote are always engaging and thoughtful, and often the voting does go on for many, many rounds. So what I'm saying is that it is no small feat to end up on these walls. This evening we're here to honor longtime teacher, Mr. John Frederick Hiltonsmith, whom the Alumni Executive Board selected as this year's subject for the series. I had the good fortune of having Mr. Hiltonsmith as a teacher. I'm just going to go ahead and say this. Mr. Hiltonsmith's class that I took was an elective, concert choir. And as much as I would love to stand before you tonight and tell you that I selected this class because I knew of John's incredible teaching skills or because I had sincere interest in the subject matter, there was really one reason, and one reason only, that I was in that class. Girls. The Hutchinson girls could take that class with us, so that class truly was like pure gold. So I liked it so much, I'm pretty sure I took it for 2 years, somehow. And I'm sure you're in complete shock that a teenage boy would ever make a decision based on something like that, but I did. And I also have to share with you that this decision really paid off for me. It was not because I ended up with a stellar singing voice or because I ended up, with a great music career. It was that I ended up with a girlfriend. As I was prepping my remarks for tonight, I did laugh out loud to myself thinking about how much crap Mr. Hiltonsmith really probably put up with all the teenage boy and girl drama, which I now really appreciate as a parent of teenagers myself. Here he was faced with a group of boys and girls that would come together for one class per day that involved people from the opposite sex. And I'm sure it was hard to control that situation, but I remember that John did, and I do remember that he was pretty patient with it, a lot more so than I would have been. On a little bit more of an academic note, I will share that as it turned out, concert choir was one of my favorite classes that I took at MUS, and it wasn't all because of the girls. Mr. Hiltonsmith actually did a great job with that class, and in particular, he was able to take a group of boys and girls that really weren't that good at singing, and somehow he did make us presentable. And he also did a good job of bringing material to us that was actually kind of interesting and engaging for teenagers. And I remember one night he brought a James Taylor tune to the group. The song was Only One, which is actually kind of a new release by JT at the time, and it just so happened that I was a big James Taylor fan. And I don't know if Mr. Hiltonsmith knew that about me or not, but as luck or fate would have it, he picked me to do a small solo part. So I was actually elated and so excited for this chance to shine at the annual spring concert at Hutchinson, and really looking forward to my big moment. And that was all really great until I totally botched the solo. It was one of those moments where I didn't anticipate the nerves, but once it got to be time for me to do my thing, I kind of froze up a little bit, and I did get the lyrics out, but they weren't good and they weren't on time. So as you can imagine, I was horrified. So when the whole thing was over and my head was down, no doubt, and I remember Mr. Hiltonsmith comforting me and encouraging me, and it was really a low point for me as a high school senior, but he did do a great job of lifting me up, and I've really never forgotten that. I always enjoyed seeing Mr. Hiltonsmith through the years as I returned back to the school from time to time, and I always felt a special connection to him. And I do think it all goes back to that moment in time where he encouraged a high school senior to get out of a bad spot. Beyond that, I always did marvel at the great things that I saw Mr. Hiltonsmith doing with the music program at the school, like his work with Beg to Differ and the recording studio and all the things that we're going to hear about from our great speakers tonight. Our first speaker this evening is our headmaster, Peter D. Sanders. Peter arrived at MUS about a year and a half ago with more than 3 decades of experience as an independent school educator and administrator. Prior to joining MUS, he served for 10 years as a director of the upper school at Christ Church Episcopal School in Greenville, South Carolina. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our distinguished headmaster, Pete Sanders.
Great. Thank you, Jason. I'm greatly honored to be here at the unveiling of Mr. Hiltonsmith's portrait. In my conversations with alumni and faculty, I've come to discover the incredible impact that Mr. Hiltonsmith has had on his students in and out of the classroom, as well as the influence he had on the music community of Greater Memphis. Quite remarkable. Memphis University School alumni remember John Hiltonsmith for the love of music he instilled in them. Audiences at the Orpheum remember his artistry at the theater's organ, and I was told just before this that it was one of those organs that comes out of the floor. It's fantastic. Music professionals remember his technical skill at audio design and engineering, and at building, restoring, and maintaining pianos and organs. His loved ones remember a humble man of boundless energy who could deconstruct and reassemble a vintage car or a pipe organ. During his 31-year tenure at MUS, he chaired the Fine Arts Department. He created the award-winning a cappella group Beg to Differ and the studio band. He planned and spearheaded the construction of the school's Bloodworth recording studio, and he oversaw the state-of-the-art recording and music engineering program. For 3 decades, his winter concert at MUS was a much-anticipated holiday celebration and tradition. I first saw all of these faculty portraits when I was a candidate for this position 2 years ago. What makes schools such as MUS so special is the positive interaction that goes on in the classroom between gifted teachers and eager students. When alumni return to campus, they want to see their teachers. I've visited many independent schools over the years, and I've never seen such a wonderful and meaningful example of a school honoring teachers as these portraits do in this dining hall. To the Hiltonsmith family, colleagues, and students of Mr. Hiltonsmith, enjoy this special ceremony and remarkable MUS tradition. And now I would like to present to you Mr. Hiltonsmith's living legacy to the school, the incomparable a cappella group Beg to Differ, under the direction of one of his students, Mr. Matt Tudor, class of 1991. Mr. Tudor.
said, how many kids? She said, a few. And it's 1927, Kansas City. Folks are driving around in their studs, bearcats with straw hats and parasols, the fashion of the day. Summer nights with ukulele strung, and they were humming to the tune of Moonlight Bay, Moonlight Bay. Bathtub gin and movie stars, 2 more payments and the baby's ours. The little things that make this life so sweet. When your only worries were your 2 sore feet. From dancing in the street in Kansas City, here I come. Nowadays there's silver in their hair. The kids have come and gone like seasons turning. 40 years since they met at the fair, and he still brings her flowers in the morning, knowing when the shadows fall, life's a circle after all, reminding her that love can never end. And suddenly she's just a girl again. And it's 1927, Kansas City. He brings her flowers every day. Love won't fade.
next speaker is Matt Tudor. He is a member of the class of 1991. Matt was a stellar student of Mr. Hiltonsmith's, and he has the distinction of being the first student conductor of the men's choir. The following year, in 1992, the choir became Beg to Differ, who we see today. At his graduation, Matt was a recipient of the Choral Music Award of Excellence, as well as a William D. Jemison III Award for Excellence in Dramatics. After MUS, he earned a bachelor's degree in jazz and studio performance from the University of Memphis, and a master's degree with academic honors in jazz composition from the New England Conservatory of Music. Matt is an accomplished composer, arranger, studio audio engineer, producer, vocalist, instrumentalist. He can do all of that, and I can barely say it. After the untimely passing of Mr. Hiltonsmith, Matt stepped in on an interim basis, but quickly discovered that he had to come back home to MUS and join the faculty full-time as director of music. The only unfortunate thing for us is that after Matt speaks, we don't have like a guitar and a whole bunch of instruments up here for him to play, because he plays in my church and he is unbelievable. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Matt Tudor.
Thank you very much. The two songs you just heard, the first is a song called 1927 Kansas City, the second a medley called the Bluegrass Gospel Medley. These are the first two barbershop pieces I'd ever heard in my life, and I heard them both on a cassette given to me by John Hiltonsmith when I was a freshman new student at MUS, basically terrified of everything. But I could sing a bit and been studying music most of my life, so I ended up in choir, directed by the strangest person I'd ever met. He was quirky, silly, irreverent, generally very odd, and funny in a way that made you roll your eyes only because you were too embarrassed to laugh out loud at things that were so incredibly corny. But he had a love of sitting at the piano and playing one song in two keys simultaneously, one key for each hand. He would correct our singing pronunciation by saying things like, "Don't you either." And he would always remind us to do things as best as we can. I'd never met anyone like him, nor have I since. They asked me to keep my remarks reasonably brief, which is a very good suggestion. It's challenging for me. If you've ever had a conversation with me, you already know that the short version, not really my jam. But I did ask myself, how do you explain the Hiltonsmith effect in a really short time? And when I asked myself that, I realized that the actual question is, how do you explain the Hiltonsmith effect at all? It's almost impossible to describe him, no matter how much time you may have, but describing his effect on people, that's an entirely different and significantly more challenging matter. I've heard story after story from student after student about how John changed the way that they heard music, the way they listened to music, the way they experienced music. Students who still, now adults, who still listen to Mozart because of John's music appreciation class. Students who still sing barbershop because of Beg to Differ. Students who had an immeasurably greater theatrical experience because of help or suggestions or assistance they got from John. But then there are people like me, and I'm under no delusion that I'm unique in what I'm about to explain, but without John Hiltonsmith, my life would have looked very, very different. I will always be grateful to the lessons and instructions that I got from him in music, and singing under him in choirs and plays and Beg to Differ will always remain the best memories of my life, but it was the non-musical lessons that I got from him that had the greatest and longest lasting effect on me in my life. The most valuable experience that I had with him, the thing that to this day remains the most pervasive effect on me, or had the most pervasive effect on me, was the simple fact that John was unapologetically John. He was himself, and I never saw him alter who he was or anything about himself to accommodate or protect someone else. He was the first person I remember ever knowing who was going to be who he was, no matter what that meant, and I don't remember this reality ever being antagonistic or reactionary in any way. It simply was what it was. He was totally fine sitting smack in the middle of awkward. When I first started working here, I heard stories of uncomfortably long hugs in the middle of the hallway. And while that particular quirk developed after I had left, I heard the stories and I thought, yeah, that sounds like John. I have two very brief stories that, for me, sum up everything that he meant to me. And from what I've heard from a lot of other students, what he meant to many others. When I was a freshman, I walked into his room. It looks very different now if you haven't been here. They built a room within a room. You should check out the studio if you haven't. Another creation of John's, the Bloodworth studio. But back then, it was just a great big huge open room, and I walked in. He was sitting in that chair that always squeaked like mad, but he was listening to a really beautiful song that I never heard before. He explained to me it was a song called "And So It Goes" by Billy Joel. We sat and listened to the song. I don't know what was going on in his life at that time. I never found out. But about halfway through the song, I looked at him and he was crying. It was the first time I'd ever had a teacher go to a space of vulnerability like that with any student anywhere, let alone me. It had an amazing effect on me. I later on figured out that that's one of the things that ended up giving me permission to love music with the passion that I do, to experience music with the passion that I do. And earlier today, listening to a piece called Suma, written by Arvo Pärt, I was literally moved to tears with students sitting in the room. I thought about "And So It Goes" by Billy Joel. Many years later, the second story, about halfway through my second semester at UTK, University of Tennessee at Knoxville, I'd come home for some reason or another, and I'd stop by to say hello. John asked me how it was going, and I told him it was quite challenging. I was not doing well, and that I had dropped out of the music program completely and had switched my major to international business. It's a true story, I swear to God. Now, I've been called out before, but this particular dressing down, it was particularly powerful. He was not polite. He was not kind. And he very colorfully told me the space from which I should remove my head. But it was the very first time that I remember getting the first inkling of belief. It's become one of my core beliefs that there is a responsibility that goes along with ability. An athlete who has a natural ability in sports has a responsibility to find out just how far that ability goes and to push himself to wherever he needs to push himself. And any ability, I believe, is like this. It's the first time I'd ever thought about it in music because of what he said. And of course, he closed with, you need to get yourself back to Tennessee or back to Knoxville and change your major back. And I did. I came home shortly after that. But those two moments ended up basically giving me permission to become the musician, the composer that I am. I hear story after story after story like this. Like I said a moment ago, I'm not in any way unique in this respect. But the last story that I will tell you, just for what this man did for me, and still does for me, I experienced it a few moments ago. I heard a story once of a virtuoso violinist who finished a concert, the entire auditorium, the entire concert hall to its feet, and he was backstage in his dressing room. The stage manager came out and said, "Are you going to go play an encore? They're cheering for you. They would really like you to go play." And he said, "I'm not going to go out there and play." The stage manager said, "Why on earth not?" And he said, "Well, do you see the gentleman in the front box up to the left?" The stage manager said, "Yes." He said, "Is that person standing and clapping?" He said, "No, he's remaining in his seat." And the violinist said, "Well, that man happens to be my teacher." Had he been standing, I would have known that I made him proud, that I played my best, and that I earned the right to come out and play another piece of music for these people. But he's not standing. So I did not make him proud. I didn't quite earn that right. So I'm not going to go play an encore. As intense as this particular story may sound, I've had two teachers in my life who I hold in that kind of regard. One of them, Bob Brookmeyer, a quite well-known jazz composer and trombonist that I became dear friends with before he passed just a few years before John, and the other, John Hiltonsmith. And every day, I get to walk in here, and as my key hits the door in that office, I get to wonder whether at the end of the day, will John be standing? Will we have done his legacy proud? The studio, beg to differ. The immense talent bubbling up from everywhere at MUS. It's one of the greatest honors of my life to have known him, to have studied under him, and of course to be up here telling you all about him. I'm going to sit down now, but I deeply appreciate the opportunity to come and say all of this, and I hope you guys enjoyed Beg to Differ. It's my honor to continue that legacy for John Hiltonsmith. Thank you.
Our next speaker is no stranger to most of us, Mr. Flip Eichner, a member of the class of 1977. As a student at MUS, Flip was very involved in theater, was a member of the Cum Laude Society, and was also the recipient, like Matt, of the Frank D. Jemison III Award for Excellence in Dramatics. After MUS, he earned his undergraduate degree in English from the University of Virginia, and he returned to MUS in the fall of 1983 to join the English department, just in time to teach me 7th grade English. He also served as theater director for many years. In 1994, he received the Distinguished Teaching Award, and in 2003, the senior class awarded him the John M. Nail Outstanding Teaching Award. Flip is currently the academic dean at MUS. Please welcome to the podium a man who I've also come to know as a great speaker, and I'm looking forward to, Mr. Flip Eichner.
No inspirational anecdotes about how I raised you up after you dangled a participle? Hanging on his MUS office wall, John Hiltonsmith kept a medieval battle mace. It was a prop left over from one of our theater productions, and in truth, that mace's spiky, murderous-looking head was actually made out of nothing but a soft, harmless Nerf ball. Just like that mace, John Hiltonsmith's personality was not so much a gradually acquired taste as one that bonked you over the head, softly and harmlessly, but a bonk over the head nonetheless. Although dealing with John never left you unnerved, it did often leave you a little bit nerfed. John lived his life far too fast for leisurely acquaintance. He had too much to do, and man, he could do a lot. Sing, conduct, play multiple instruments, arrange music, engineer recordings and soundboards, teach, orate, act, refinish furniture, refurb houses, refurb cars, refurb pipe organs, tune pianos, build, paint, repair plumbing and electricity, you name it. So he hadn't the time for leisure. To relieve his tireless pace, he wasn't so much forever in search of a little R&R, rest and relaxation, as he was forever in search of a little G&B, goof and ball. This was his way of cutting to the chase. We all think of Beg to Differ as the name of our a cappella men's choir, but Beg to Differ was also a bang-on encapsulation of John Hiltonsmith. In one of my first ever conversations with the goofball John Hiltonsmith, right after his hiring in 1984, we were just 1 year apart in both age and date of employment, he came up to me in his slightly shaggy hair and brushy mustache that, in combination with his smooth, warmly enveloping baritone voice, always reminded me of Captain Kangaroo. Except Hiltonsmith was more likely to be dropping the ping pong balls than being ping ponged upon. In fact, knowing what I know about John's sense of humor, I think he would have gotten a magnificent kick out of having his portrait painted with a crafty grin on his face as he emptied out a large sack of ping pong balls, and our hanging that portrait right over here directly above the picture of Mr. Bowman. But back to the first time I met John. The first time I met John, he ran up urgently and demanded, "Quick, ask me if I'm an orange." "Are you an orange?" I asked. He paused, looked at me like I was an utter idiot, and said, "No," and walked away. Over the ensuing weeks, I discovered fellow teacher after fellow teacher who had been similarly nerfed by the new guy. "Have you met the music teacher, Hiltonsmith? He came up to me out of the blue and told me to ask him if he was an orange." "Hey, did that Hiltonsmith guy tell you to ask him if he was an orange?" "Who is this new teacher telling everybody to ask him whether he's an orange?" This series of discoveries, by the way, led to one of my favorite MUS memories of Kurt Schmidt, who headed our religion department at the time, whom I had been teasing for many months because Kurt simply could not tell a joke. So you can imagine how much I laughed when Kurt complained to me one evening, "Have you met this weird new guy, John Hiltonsmith? He came up to me and said, 'Ask me what I am.'" Goofball John liked to nerf people out of their comfort zones. Our accounting administrator, Melissa Sanger, remembers herself as a prissy little diva when, as a youngster, she appeared in my production of The Sound of Music, which John Music directed, as the youngest Von Trapp daughter, Gretel. So John forever after called her Gruntle. John would frequently challenge alums in the hallway. "Didn't you graduate? Why are you still hanging around? Should we be calling the police?" He loved the sprung rhythm of the old joke, "What's up in the road? Ahead?" So almost daily when I passed him in the mess hallway, John would ask, "How are you feeling? Anyway?" Over time, John would draft Andy Saunders and Kurt Schmidt and Barry Ray and me and several others to sing in a faculty chorus for which he selected an off-kilter Christmas piece by the eccentric and completely fictitious composer P.D.Q. Bach, the only forgotten son of the Bach family, whose witty lyrics are similarly sprung. Thus, "Throw the Yule log on, Uncle John," becomes "Throw the Yule log on Uncle John." Or "Hear the hall clock strike, Uncle John," turns into "Hear the hall clock strike, Uncle John." This wacky Christmas carol formed part of a collection that also included those familiar Noel classics, "Good King Kong Looked Out," and "Oh Little Town of Hackensack." This was John Hiltonsmith's sprung sense of humor. One of my favorite shows I directed at MUS was Guys and Dolls, a musicalization of Damon Runyon's stories about underworld gangsters as lovable verbal cartoons. It was entirely fitting that when I recruited native New Yorker Hiltonsmith to play one of those gangsters, his character was named Nicely Nicely. John was not without his peccadillos, but they were almost always cartoon faults, and at heart he was incontestably Nicely Nicely. Elliot Dent recalls that although John occasionally referred to himself as just a Long Island dirtbag, he would be the first to offer a young new teacher free help rebuilding his busted car transmission. Trey Suddarth recalls John's uncompensated help retooling the pipe organ at the Reverend Mrs. Suddarth's church. I knew firsthand John's innumerable late-night contributions to MUS theater set construction, and John gave of himself literally in his perennial blood donations to St. Jude. John regularly invited me to accompany him and beg to differ on their periodic contest trips so I could help chaperone and also direct the choir's stage presence during performances. His generous invitations meant that over the years I got to travel to New York, Chicago, New Orleans, San Francisco, and Boston, and to several of these cities multiple times, opportunities I would never have enjoyed were it not for John. And he radically changed my wide-eyed young son's life immeasurably by letting him accompany us to New York on one of those trips. On a Beg to Differ trip to New Orleans, John took me, awestruck, on a tour of the historic Sanger Theater, where John tirelessly contributed his unremunerated skills to repairing the Hurricane Katrina damaged house organ. And he conducted me into the theater's basement, where I met Bill, the facilities manager, in his well-lived-in office furnished with easy chairs, a soft rag rug, a space heater, and a large basset hound gently napping on the rug. John introduced me to Bill, who had been with that theater for decades, and I shook Bill's hand. Then John introduced me to old Barney, the basset hound, who had been with Bill for 18 years. And John reassured me with paternal warmth that it was okay to pet the dog. So I bent down and gently stroked old Barney, while John and Bill chuckled at my unreciprocated expressions of affection for that stiff, cold exemplar of the magic of canine taxidermy. Nerfed again. Whenever John overheard his students griping in class, he would sarcastically offer, "Aw, would you like a hug?" The students would typically balk, but they would also stop griping. Eventually, of course, one of them would call John's bluff, so when he asked, "Aw, would you like a hug?" the student would say, "Sure." So John would give him a great big bear hug. Later, the students themselves would initiate the goofiness and start calling down the hall, "Hey, Mr. Hiltonsmith, want a hug?" And John would heartily accept. On another Beg to Differ trip, this time to New York, John and I went together for lunch at the historic Stage Door Deli. John ordered the Reuben, and I ordered the pastrami. When the waiter asked John what he wanted to drink, John ordered a vanilla milkshake. Then the waiter turned to me, eyed me up and down, and asked, "What about you? Diet Coke?" So for months afterward, whenever I passed Hiltonsmith in the hall, he would ask, "What about you? A Diet Coke?" And I'd answer, "Shut up." And he'd answer, "Aw, want a hug?" When I surveyed several of my faculty colleagues for their memories of John, just about every one of them immediately recalled the uncomfortably long hugs in the hallway. Of course, a simple hug wasn't goofy enough between adults, so those hugs usually ended with John's grabbing someone's backside. The upshot of this was, it was impossible to feel formal and awkward and standoffish with John Hiltonsmith. He deliberately broke down all barriers in his stubborn determination to be pegged as the goofball. And this self-effacing dedication to fun has everything to do with what a great teacher John could be in the classroom and in the music studio. An ever-present sound in the MUS music studio was John Hiltonsmith between class periods pounding away at the finger-twisting piano solo in the middle of Billy Joel's Scenes from an Italian Restaurant. And there the students would find him when they arrived for class or for rehearsal. While many teachers will self-consciously hide their preparations behind the scenes and will stiffly present themselves before their students as unimpeachable experts, John continually laid bare all his imperfections and then some. That they saw him practicing this extraordinarily difficult Billy Joel piece and most frequently just blowing it and having to start over again invited many of them over time to see whether they too could play Scenes from an Italian Restaurant. That John continually let down his guard and played the goofball evaporated his students' inhibitions and opened them up to fuller artistic expression. Rather than bulldozing them with intimidation and fear, his sense of humor made them hunger to partake all the further simply because John made it all look like so much fun. And building their confidence and uninhibited willingness to give any challenge a try is precisely why so many of John's students over the years triumphed as his occasional soloists or student conductors, or later as a cappella choir members or even leaders at college or university, or perhaps even went on to assume leadership of the Memphis area Memphis Men's Barbershop Group, succeeding one of that group's most notable prior directors, Mr. John Hiltonsmith himself. It is because John taught his boys the rewards of dropping their inhibitions and giving their best that John, though through misunderstanding, could neglect to rehearse Beg to Differ for the annual Thanksgiving Chapel commemoration and then call the choir up on cue and inform them with no prior warning, standing there in front of the entire student body and faculty, that they would now sing Waiting on the World to Change, that they all just trustingly went along with him and sang it beautifully. It is precisely because John's warmly unintimidating, fun-loving manner so successfully invited his students to put themselves out there and lead as musicians themselves that when he died, just 1 week before the annual Christmas concert, I could walk into the Beg to Differ classroom and find that one of the students was already leading his fellow singers in vocal warm-ups. And why one of BTD's recent alums, freshly in town from college, could step in without losing a beat and conduct the choir's performance in the concert. and why another of John's former students could merge seamlessly into conducting the studio band in the Christmas concert and then eventually step permanently into John's shoes as our director of music. Whenever we went to concert, I would drill Beg to Differ on the importance of careful concentration and focus and listening to and thinking about the meanings of their lyrics, and most of all, the dire importance of impressing the judges with how much fun it was to sing. So when Beg to Differ took the stage and awaited a signal from the judges that they were permitted to begin their competition set, quite frankly, the boys looked like nervous wrecks. Yay me. When John received the judge's signal, he would blow a pitch, tune the opening note, and raise his arms to signal the opening attack. A hushed silence would fall over the hall. Suddenly, John would drop his arms, lean into the boys, and whisper something irreverent and silly to them, and they would all burst out laughing. Then he would raise his arms again, the set would start, and they would just kill it. Although I may have taught the boys to appreciate intellectually how important it was to appear to enjoy what they were doing, John actually made them relax and enjoy it. And that made all the difference. John leaves a huge legacy, and I think that would have pleased him because of how very much weight he gave to history. He loved the history of Palace theaters, and the history of film, and the history of the Broadway musical, and the history of Ardent Studios and Memphis music, and the origins of power pop in a rock group called Big Star. John loved the part that MUS has played in Memphis music history. He loved historic cars and historic homes and the history of his own residential neighborhood, the Ansdale Park Historic District. John Hiltonsmith loved the history of the Beatles. And he loved teaching music history and made his students love it too. Because John loved and understood the history of New York, where he had grown up, he canceled his planned lessons on 9/11 and taught his students the role that infamous day would play in the history of his home city. In one especially striking example, John brought history to bear upon his teaching and upon his students' musicianship. In the summer of 2005, Beg to Differ enjoyed a rare opportunity to visit France and stay at the Dalle Chateau, La Rodière, culminating in a performance in Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Rehearsal for that once-in-a-lifetime opportunity did not go well. The boys had stayed up the night before too late and were inattentive, and their performance was flat and lackluster. John could have thrown a tantrum and ranted and threatened, but as we know, that was just not his style. So he sat the boys down and he quietly told them the history of the song Precious Lord, which they were rehearsing. Its composer, Thomas Dorsey, son of a minister, had traveled to St. Louis to sing at a revival and had therefore left his very pregnant wife, Nettie, in Chicago. During the revival in St. Louis, Dorsey was handed a telegram that informed him that Nettie had died in childbirth, but that he had a son. Sorry, levels of vulnerability I wasn't expecting to show. Devastated, Dorsey returned to Chicago, but when he arrived, he found that his baby son had died as well. John told the boys that Dorsey was so grief-stricken that he wanted to die himself, but then he sat down at the piano and composed Precious Lord from the depths of his suffering. As I'm sure you would understand, there is no way I will be able to get through reading you the lyrics. So I invite you to look them up later and possibly partake yourselves of the same weeping those boys did after they gave the most compelling, crowd-mesmerizing performance of their careers in the most famous cathedral in the world. and then had to be shepherded by a kindly priest to a private room to regather their emotions. On the Saturday that John died, I received a call from the headmaster, Ellis Hagewood, who said, "Have you heard that John Hiltonsmith died?" I have no idea how the rest of that phone conversation went. I just remember hanging up with a very confused idea that I needed to let Mr. Hagewood know whether that rumor was true. Of course it couldn't be. This was just John's sprung sense of humor, and we were being nerfed yet again. I spent about an hour searching the internet and repeatedly dialing John's cell phone so he could laugh with me over this ridiculous story going around. I got no answer, and a Facebook post from a reliable source eventually left no doubt. So I called back Mr. Hagewood and reported, "I discovered the rumor is true." He responded gently, "I'm sorry, Flip. I did not call earlier for confirmation. I was calling with information." As you would guess, I was finally unnerved by John Hiltonsmith. And I felt then, as I have felt ever since, I could really go for a hug. Thank you.
Our portrait of Mr. Hiltonsmith is by renowned artist Bart Lindstrom, who graduated from the University of Southern California with a degree in business marketing and then went on to study at the Art Center in Pasadena. He is a nationally recognized artist, conference speaker, former board member of the American Society of Portrait Artists, and he helped found the Portrait Society of America. Bart's career started with watercolors and moved into oils. He specializes in portrait and figurative paintings. Among prominent collectors of his work are United States Senators William Armstrong and Jesse Helms, Tennessee Governor Ned McWhorter, Roots author Alex Haley, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Vice President Dan Quayle, and Secretary of State General Colin Powell. His paintings hang in state capitals and federal courtrooms and in private and corporate collections, now including Memphis University School. Unfortunately, Mr. Lindstrom could not be with us this evening. He's represented locally by Miss Elizabeth Francis, a broker from Portraits, Inc. So I'm now going to ask Mr. Hiltonsmith's wife, Sherry, and his daughters, Jennifer and Joya, to join Mr. Sanders and me as we unveil the portrait. As the walls of the dining hall continue to become lined with the portraits of revered faculty members like Mr. Hiltonsmith, who have played important and influential roles in the lives of generations of students, we are constantly reminded of the primary reason we continue to appreciate and support Memphis University School. Mr. Hiltonsmith devoted his life to the students and to the school. His influence will continue to impact so many of us for years to come. On behalf of Memphis University School, the Alumni Executive Board, it is my pleasure to present to the school this portrait of Mr. John Frederick Hiltonsmith.
This is on you. When Perry asked me to speak, I told him I don't do this. I don't do this well. I don't do it at all. And I really didn't want today to be a sad occasion. I wanted it to be something where we shared joy, and you guys have done that. You have brought him back to life to me. I was with John when he left us. And the time stamp that left on me, I will never get over. But I have come to realize how much of his life he gave to me and to everyone involved in it, and mostly here at this school. When I met him, I didn't understand the importance of MUS. So when he told me this is where he worked, my response was, and he had kind of a dumbfounded look, like, really? It didn't take him long to invite me to a performance with Beg to Differ, because those of you that knew him well knew he was a showman, and he did enjoy the limelight and spotlight and showing off. And that's why he invited me, because he was trying to impress me. So when the boys started singing, and I heard the notes ringing, and I realized that they did it for their love of music and of him, I started paying attention. And I came to love what the boys do and the ambassadors that they are for MUS over my time with John. And I didn't realize until they got up and started singing, which it looks like most of them have left now. I'm sorry about that. I didn't realize how much I missed it until they got up here today. Thank you, Matt, for what you've done. Thank you for being willing to come in on a moment's notice and make that Christmas concert happen. In my eyes, it had to. One way or another, that concert had to come off. If John had had to pick a replacement for himself, it would have been you. I hope you know that. I'm excited for what you're doing. I'm excited in what I saw tonight with the boys. So thank you for that. I really don't have a lot else except that if there are those of you that have a favorite John story, I really wish you would come up and tell me, because I'd like to have those memories too. I'm going to defer to the girls because both of them wanted to speak as well.
Hello. So I'm very bad at this as well, and now I'm a wreck because of you, but I will try to make my way through it. So I've always thought that I've been a little biased in thinking that my dad was the best dad out there. He was amazing and a supportive dad. He helped to expose Julia and me to music, the arts, and many other experiences, like the Orpheum, to the organs, to New Orleans, to New York, all kinds of different things. He molded our personalities to be strong-minded, passionate, and independent. However, as the years have gone by, I've had the chance to meet so many former students, parents, and just people who've had interactions with him in general. And I've realized that I'm not actually biased because he was my dad. He was just that wonderful of a person. And he impacted so many people's lives in the same ways that he's impacted me and my sister and my family. So thank you to everyone who helped to get this together to honor his memory. And if you know my dad and you know my dad's humor, then you know that he of all people would say that he definitely deserved this.
So my dad hated photos, so I think he'd be particularly pleased with this form of representation. And I'm also quite pleased because when I look at this portrait, I see my father with an almost unfair level of realisticness. Starting with his predictable Monday through Friday, everyday attire, all the way down, well, you can't see the worn out wallabies, but you can see that they're there. And then the daily bow tie choice, which I don't know about you guys, but was very exciting for me to see what he was going to wear that day. And I can almost smell his Burberry cologne that he wore daily, and it almost clung to his clothes the same way that Jennifer and I clung to him. It even possesses that same look in his eyes, that look of knowledge. You might be familiar with it. It's the one that he often wore when he was about to tell you some fun fact about an album or a band, probably big star of the Beatles, but sometimes he surprised us. And I almost expect his lips to part and whistle a tune, or for him to clear his throat in that rhythmic way that he often did. Or even I can see him like about to conduct some finger drumming on whatever surface that was nearby him with flimsy fingers. Which brings me to his hands. That's the part that I most enjoy about this portrait. It was his hands, those ever-excited extremities that loved to dance across the keys of the mighty Wurlitzer and tinker with recording equipment or the insides of antique cars, or most importantly, to forcefully flick me on the head, even if I tried to dodge it. It was the capabilities of those hands that, in my adolescent eyes, seemed to mar the name of Billy Joel, which he would be mortified to hear me say, but I'm saying it anyway. So this is all to say how grateful I am to the school for honoring my dad in this way, and of course to the artist for the wonderful work he did with this portrait. Seeing it has reminded me of all the things that I love about my father, and I hope it does the same for everyone else who gets the chance to see it.
On behalf of, and thank you to the Hiltonsmith family, that was really great, and have all three of you come up. I'm not sure I've even seen that before, so thank you for sharing. On behalf of all members of the Alumni Executive Board, I want to thank you all for being here tonight. We invite you to stay and visit, and please to congratulate the family of Mr. Hiltonsmith before you go home. Safe travels and good night.